Greetings, this is Greg. I'm overhauling the Fiat 1.4 Turbo multi-air engine, and this is the original motor out of my car. It's very low mileage. I just have it apart to do some upgrades, which makes a great opportunity for me to show you guys some of the things I like about this particular type of engine and some of the upgrades that I'm doing. This is my 124 over here. I'm getting ready to pull the engine out of it. That is a replacement motor I put in because I anticipated significant downtime waiting for machining services and stuff. And I wanted to keep my original motor in my car. So that's actually this motor. The other motor that's in there is a motor I got a pretty good deal on. Interesting story there. I'm not going to get into it right now. So let's start with the oil pan. The oil pan is a very nice unit. It's a cast aluminum piece. This gasket surface, or what would traditionally be a gasket surface, actually requires no gasket. It seals perfectly to its mating surface because both the oil pan side and the other surface are machined perfectly. And so you just need to use a RTV silicone based sealant on it and then bolt it up. However, that sealant is Fiat specific and the dealers don't even stock it. So if you're doing this kind of work, you want to get that sealant in advance, and it's like $28 a tube also. The oil pan has a built-in windage tray, which is really nice, so you don't need that. And if you look at the other side, it has ribs, and if you were to look at this installed in the car, you would see that the underbody work is set up so that air exiting the engine compartment, or at least a large amount of it, has to flow over these ribs for engine cooling. So bad idea to modify the underbody stuff on one of these cars unless you know what you're doing. There are some things, for example, we have a skid plate for sale for the 500 that retains that functionality. Very important to consider things like that. So the oil pan is designed to help keep the oil cool. Well, why is that? Well, because it's a turbocharged engine, and one of the things we have for anti-knock protection, you can see it here. I've removed the bearing itself, and you can see that oil comes up through there and would normally come through one of these holes to pressurize the bearing surfaces. But some of the oil doesn't come up through those holes, and it goes here. That is an oil squirter, and you can see it there sticking out of what here is the bottom. The engine's upside down. That sprays oil onto the bottom of the piston. There's one for each cylinder, and that's a big part of this engine's anti-knock protection. So if your oil temps are high because your engine's low on oil, or you've screwed something up, that's going to contribute to knock. So it's very important, especially on a modded engine, to keep the oil level full or very near full. And these squirters have to come out in order to rebore the block. So it's very important that you remember to put them back in. Otherwise, your engine won't have any oil pressure when you start it up, or at least very little, and that would be bad. So keep in mind the oil squirters are very important to the engine. And there are aftermarket oil coolers for these, but the factory oil cooler in this engine is very good. Really no need to change it. One upgrade that is good, although it's not available for the Fiat 124, but it is available for this type of car, the Fiat 500. A company called Prometeo makes a larger capacity oil pan, and that's a pretty good investment for a really modified car. Okay, moving on from the oil pan, some more fun facts about the 124 motor. At the back, and this is the back of the motor, and by the way, this area here should not be painted. I'll be stripping that out. That was a mistake. And the reason it shouldn't be painted is that this has a fairly unconventional rear main seal. Obviously, oil's under pressure in this bearing, and some of it will escape out the back of the motor, and you'd have a huge leak. So all cars have some sort of seal at the rear main bearing here. And the way it works in the Fiat is there's a structure, and you can see the bolt holes for it, that bolt onto here, and that oil will then drain by gravity, remember it's upside down, back into the oil pan through there. You'll see how that happens in a moment. So, because we don't want hot oil dissolving the paint and then paint being in the oil, I don't really think it hurt anything, but why take the chance? Don't leave this painted. The factory didn't. That's a mistake. I'll be taking care of it. Moving along, notice this has effectively a 4-bolt main. That's pretty special. And here's the crankshaft, and this is the main bearing assembly. Notice all the main bearings are interconnected. So instead of having individual caps for each main bearing, it's one solid structure, and it is just amazingly strong. I don't know. Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to shut the phone off, remove the crank so I can show you what I'm going to show you. Okay, we're back. Notice that there is a steel insert for each main bearing. So this isn't just, it's all one piece. It links all of the bearings together, but there are steel inserts to further add to the strength. And on the other side, where the bolts go through, I think you can see it there, there are steel inserts there at the other end. So this whole, I gotta do this with one hand, this whole structure is immensely strong. Now, another thing to think about, this also seals, well, one side of this seals to the block, this side, the other side to the oil pan. Now, this also seals only with that special Fiat dealer-only RTV stuff. Now, notice this channel here, and one on the other side, and they're at the front as well, here and here. Okay, very important if you're building one of these engines that you don't fill this channel up with RTV silicone. The silicone has to stop here and then continue here. The reason is because when this is on the engine, remember we talked about on the bearing here, oil gets into here. The way it drains back is through this little channel. So if you clog up those channels with RTV, thinking you're using a prodigious amount to prevent oil leaks, you're actually going to create an oil leak because oil will not be able to escape from the rear main seal structure back into the pan. So that's an important thing to consider. Another thing we need to talk about while we're here, if you find yourself overhauling one of these, you're going to run into this issue. There are obviously 5 main bearings, and there are 4 sets of rod bearings. The Fiat manual says to inspect them for abnormal wear, and if they're not abnormally worn, you can reuse them. That's pretty unusual in engine building. Normally you'd reuse them, or normally, I'm sorry, you would not reuse them and get new ones, but the Fiat bearings don't really wear. So I understand why you would want to do that. Now, each bearing may be a slightly different size from the factory. They have 3 different sizes, and they color-coded them with paint. I promise you, when you take your motor apart, that paint will have been long gone, and you won't be able to tell whether you have blue bearings, red, or yellow. So, a few ways to handle this. One, when you take the engine apart, make sure to keep the bearings, put them in a bag, cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or I'm sorry, not cylinder, bearings 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4-cylinder engine, 5 main bearings. Keep them separate and keep track of what's what. That'll simplify things for you. Now, if they're abnormally worn, you can use a ball micrometer, not a normal micrometer, because you won't be able to measure the thickness of this bearing with a standard mic, but you need to get a ball mic or a ball attachment for your micrometer and measure the thickness in a non-worn spot and see what they are. That way you can order the correct bearing. You can match up your thickness with the colors in the Fiat parts manual and figure out what bearings to order. Okay, option 2, there's a code on the block and there's a code on the crank. And if you have the manual, you may or may not be able to decipher that code. Kind of depends on what year you have. And that code will tell you for your exact engine what bearings it had. And apparently it could be different. Like you could, in main bearing 1, you could have a blue on the carrier side here and let's say a red on the block side. So there's a code that actually tells you what's what. Now, all the center bearings are the same. So that makes that pretty easy. There's only one size center bearing unless, of course, if the crank has been reground, all bets are off. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about standard stuff here. So very important, keep all the bearings straight. And if they do have abnormal wear, you're going to have to determine with the ball mic what bearing it was unless you can crack that code. Now, the next thing is, and I really suggest you do this, period, is you really should plastic gauge these bearings. I don't care if they mic out right on spec or what. There's just too much chance of something being wrong. So Plastigauge, and there are plenty of videos on it. I suggest the one by Eric, the car guy. He does it on a rod bearing, but it's just as well. It's a little strip of plastic. You can actually see a little remnant of it. I think I just broke it off with my finger, but see it sticking out right there? You lay that across the bearing assembly. You torque the crankshaft down, and you measure the thickness. Can you see that little green, very faded green mark running this way? That was the plastic strip. It's smushed out. The tighter the clearances are, the bigger the smushing. Then you get out your Plastigauge clearance checker and you lay it against the smush there and figure out what your bearing clearances are. And I'm happy to say that all of my bearings are exactly right on the money. So, although I don't need to get new bearings, well, I do need to get a center one. I'm going to show you why in a moment. But although none of my bearings had any abnormal wear, they're all fine. I'm still replacing them, but I know exactly what to replace them with because I've mic'd them and I've Plastigauged them and make sure they're good. So when the new bearings get here, I'll Plastigauge them and move on. Let me show you one more thing on the crank, and then I'll get to the modifications we're doing. Okay, in my hand here, I'm holding a thrust bearing. There are two of them. These are what the crank rides on if it moves fore and aft. Now, the thrust bearing should be attached to the center bearing, which is why I need to get a new center bearing. But the thrust bearing sets in there just like that, and then one would also be on the other side. And they're not attached. They got, one of them broke off when I was removing it, and the other one I broke off intentionally since I wanted to see how strong it was, and I knew I had to get a new one anyway. So, we've got a new center bearing coming from the dealer, and as I said, those are all they're all the same size, so that made that fairly easy. Torquing this down, yeah, there's 20 bolts for the main bearings, and complicated procedure. There's a very specific order you have to go in, and you torque some of them, and then other ones, then you come back to them, and I think it's a total of 5 steps. It's not terrible, but it takes some time to do it. I want to talk about bolts on this engine really quickly. There are 3 types of bolts which you may need to replace. There's the big main bearing bolts here. There are head bolts and rod bolts. The bolts for the connecting rods, we go here, must be replaced. You cannot reuse those. Now, the bolts for this and for the head, you can inspect and see if they're damaged. What you're looking for is for a decrease in diameter somewhere in the threaded portion. If there's anywhere in the threads that the bolt decreases in diameter, it needs to be replaced. On this end, those are used bolts there. I'm just using it for retorquing Plastigauge and stuff. This engine's getting all new bolts just because with what I plan to do with it, I think it should have all new bolts. There are some aftermarket bolts that you may want to consider. I'm not doing that on this motor, but something worth mentioning. Okay, so let's get to the modifications. First of all, the motor's very precisely balanced. And Fiat engines aren't that far out of balance anyway, but I'm planning on having a very usable RPM range up to 7,000, so probably set the rev limiter at 7,200. So we're not going crazy here, but I really want it to be nice and smooth all the way up there. So even though it wasn't far out of balance from the factory, it's balanced about as well as it can be now. Bit of trivia, it is balanced on the exact same balancing machine that balanced all of the factory Corvette ZR1s, the ones that came out in the late 80s, the 4-cammer 32 valves. Those engines were built very near where I live at Mercury Marine, and my machinist owns that balancing rig. So that's kind of a fun bit of trivia. All right, let me shut this off so I can move things around here, and then we'll continue. All right, moving on. I think that was enough about the crankshaft. The big thing there is the bearings. You do not want to mess that up, so please heed my instructions and Plastigauge. And I would Plastigauge it on both sides, which I did just in case something's slightly out of round. It probably won't be. You like my racing red? That's a historical Alfa Romeo color. Okay, the cylinder block is bored out, as you probably guessed, because I mentioned that had to remove the oil squirters. It's necessary to do that for the boring machine to fit down in there. Plus, you don't want to risk them getting damaged. I'd hate to try and buy those at the dealer. It might be tough to even explain what they are. So, the block is bored out. It's not bored out a whole lot. It's a little bit over 1,400 cc's stock. I know Fiat calls it a 1.4, but it's really a 1368 cc motor stock. And so it's not a lot. It's another roughly 2.8% displacement. That's not a lot, but it's not trivial. I mean, the OEM guys sometimes increase amounts near that. You know, as an example, the Chrysler 426 Wedge went to, they increased their size of their biggest motor to a 440. That's about 3.2%. So, you know, we're in the ballpark of, say, a smaller OEM displacement increase. Now, the reason I wanted that displacement increase is because we're decreasing the compression on the motor. And the reason I wanted to decrease the compression is because I wanted to be able to run more boost. It has a lot of supporting mods that I'm not getting into right now, but you know, turbo intake, big intercooler, improved exhaust, all of those things that are around the motor. And to be able to run a little bit more boost, I wanted to run a little bit less compression. And the displacement increase, although small, will just about offset the drop in compression at a given level of boost, or more importantly in this case, when not on boost, so for normal city driving. This is the new piston. It is lighter than stock. More about that later. It is much stronger than stock, and it is slightly lower compression than stock. The pistons aren't available yet because they're not tested, but assuming this all works out, and I can't imagine that it won't, we'll probably have those pistons available. So everything we've talked about so far is really mostly for strength. The balancing helps the motor do a little better job being smooth at high RPM. The pistons obviously are the big mod, and they add strength. The displacement, relatively insignificant amount of power, but also not nothing. And that's pretty much the whole bottom end. I'm keeping the stock connecting rods, and the reason for that is the stock rods are forged rods. Okay, they're pretty good. They're not spectacular, but they're pretty good. They're very strong in terms of compressive strength, which means I'm not going to damage them just through horsepower or torque. The way they will break is from excessive expansion. In other words, at real high RPM, when the crankshaft reverses direction and the piston's trying to go up and the connecting rod's trying to pull it down, that's when you can have a connecting rod failure in these motors. But the stock connecting rods are absolutely perfectly safe to 7,500 RPM, and there's no way I'm going to 7,500 or certainly not above that. Also, the lighter pistons reduce the expansion forces that are being thrown against the connecting rod. So at a given RPM, I have a greater margin of safety with these pistons. So I just didn't go with upgraded rods. I know people are going to ask me that, and I didn't do it because it's an expense that is pretty significant and that I won't benefit from in my particular application. Of course, you certainly could add performance rods to an identical build, at which point you would really have about the strongest and best bottom end of a Fiat 1.4 you could have without getting into, you know, really serious bank breaking stuff. Next we have the performance cylinder head. I'm particularly excited about this. It's a ported head. It retains the stock valves. I wanted the OEM quality for everything in the valve train, and also there's a bang for the buck sort of thing and law of diminishing returns that comes into effect with larger valves. There's 16 valves, and it's very expensive to go to larger valves when you've got 16 of them, especially on this engine. And the gains from that just aren't worth it. So it's porting only. And actually, and we had a really serious porting expert consult with us and do some of the work on this thing. And I was actually surprised. The porting is more of a precision thing than a volume thing. I'm not going to take it out of the bag right now, but the ports are not visibly that much bigger than stock. They are a little bit bigger, but most of the work is near the valve seat, just upstream of the valve seat or downstream, I guess, depending on intake or exhaust side, but near the valve seat. The valve seat itself has changed a bit, the angles, and it really flows well. We flowed this against the stock head, and I was very pleasantly surprised about the results. Oh, also, yeah, don't paint that section, just like on the back, for the same reason. So that's it. It's really pretty close to a stock motor. It's bored out with new pistons. You'd have to do that on a stock overhaul, so it took a little bit of extra displacement. The pistons I went with aren't much more expensive than the stock ones, and they're much stronger and lighter, so I'm very happy about that. And lower compression. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. The crank is stock, it's just balanced, and it's got a ported head for more flow. So I hate to get into power predictions because, it's all just talk until the motor's together, but I will say this same motor in stock form with full bolt-ons made, I think it was, well, we ran it in so many different configurations, it's hard to say, but I do know the most power we ever got out of this thing was a little bit over 250 horsepower at the wheels. Never really ran it like that other than just for testing. I wasn't totally happy with it in that configuration, but we ran it a lot at 220 horse at the wheels, and I think it set its quarter-mile time, which as far as I know is the fastest ever for one of these cars on gasoline. And I want to say it had 215 or 220 at the wheels at that time. It ran in the 14.3s at, I think, 98 or 99 miles an hour, right around there. And furthermore, it did it, it ran between 1434 and 1440 something 3 times in a row. The strip was fairly empty, so I was able to do 3 runs back to back, and I think that really showed that the engine holds up really well, and also that our big intercooler and air intake don't heat soak to the extent that the factory products do. I've not seen any other car run those kind of times back to back. Well, not any other car, but I haven't seen another 124 run those kind of times relatively back to back ever, certainly not on gasoline. So, hey, let's talk a little bit about effective compression ratio, because I think I mentioned that the whole point of going to slightly lower compression, mechanical compression, is to allow us to run more boost. So I'll talk about that just briefly. Let me just pull up a quick chart I made, and here we go. So I'll explain here why I'm lowering the compression ratio of the engine. And this is going to be a very basic discussion, and this chart, while the math for it was 100% solid, due to my graph making skills, the chart is not perfect, but it's certainly in the ballpark, good enough for government work. So, the mechanical compression ratio of a Fiat 1.4 multi-air turbo, at least all the ones sold in the US, is 9.8 to 1. Now, when you pack more air into the cylinders using boost, the engine effectively has higher compression, especially in terms of knock resistance, because when the piston comes up, it's compressing more air into the same volume. And the more boost you put on it, the higher the effective compression ratio. So let's follow the red line from the sample up from 9.8 to 1 up to the engine's peak boost of 20 psi. Note, some Fiats peak at 18, some peak at 21. There's some factory literature that talks about 22, but that really only happens at very specific altitudes and temperatures in specific cars. 20, 21 is about the most you ever see. So anyway, that line goes up to about 20 psi. Then follow it all the way across to the left, and you see that we have an effective compression ratio on a stock engine at 20 psi of just over 15 to 1. Now, let's just suppose, I'm just going to make up a number here, let's suppose we lower the compression to 8.8 to 1. If we follow that red line across to 8.8 to 1, we can see that puts us in terms of boost in between the 27 and 30. Let's call it 28.5. So with the same effective compression ratio and roughly the same resistance to knock, there's some variables here because as you run more boost, you're going to generate more heat. So we're not taking that into account. But in terms of effective compression ratio, you have the same effective compression ratio with 9.8 to 1 compression at 20 psi as you do with 8.8 to 1 compression at nominally 28 psi. So decreasing the compression allows, although that in itself reduces power a little bit, it allows so much more boost, you can get a lot more power. Now we're not reducing to 8.8 to 1 in this case, but as you can see, any reduction that's meaningful allows for a few more pounds of boost, greater margin of safety, more power. So that's what we're doing. In terms of power, I mentioned earlier that we got a little over 250 horse at the wheels from this engine before. The reason I didn't run that was because the effective compression ratio required to get that power was so high that I was concerned that any little hiccups would cause knock, and I felt that the engine was highly, highly dependent on its water injection system to stay together. Just not something that I wanted to run all the time or provide to customers. But I think we'll easily be able to get that power with a very safe effective compression ratio with the new setup, and then quite a bit more with the water injection, especially if we go with water methanol. So that's enough about effective compression ratio. Like I say, that's a very, very basic discussion of that, but the chart is close enough. You can certainly use it for any engine builds, unless it's something you're really running on the ragged edge. Here's my 124 from its time at the drag strip, and I'll put up the time slips. We're looking to beat this by a significant margin. We've now got a modded engine, and probably put better tires on it, and because I was just running street tires and not all that wide. And we've got some other mods that I'm really excited to talk about, but I'm not allowed to yet. And it's other external mods that could be used on a built motor or a non-built motor. By the way, that head we think will work very, very well on a otherwise stock internal motor. We're going to be testing that as well. So that's about it. I'll leave you with a little bit of extra footage, battleship stuff, and I hope everybody's having a great day, and hope to see everybody on the next video. Thanks. Goodbye.